Okay, in this third and slightly longer video, we're going to be looking at two main things. First of all, what's meant by the different economic systems, and this isn't something you need to know in a lot of detail, so we will go through it relatively quickly. But more important, what's meant by the three key economic questions and how Australia goes about answering those three key economic questions. So first things first, just from the first video, when you're talking about the relationship between relative scarcity, economic decision-making, and opportunity cost, so basically relative scarcity is the basic economic problem facing all societies. It's important to recognise that it's the balance between having limited resources, land, labour, and capital mainly, and unlimited wants and needs. So you need to define what relative scarcity is. Because of relative scarcity, we have to make choices because we can't have everything we want, or decisions about how we allocate our resources, given the limited resources available, and in what quantities we're going to produce as well. This gives rise, because we have to make choices, this gives rise to opportunity cost, which is the value of the next best alternative foregone whenever we make a decision about how we allocate our scarce resources. So the best way to answer these questions is to finish off with an example. So if more additional resources or finances are allocated to education, it may mean fewer resources are available for national defence, for example. So in this video, we're going to be looking at this idea of relative scarcity, the choices that economies have to make, and how they answer these three basic economic questions, which we'll talk about later on. So first of all, countries can have different systems of ownership. They can have a capitalist system. A capitalist system, the key word there is that things are privately owned. Businesses are privately owned, and the idea is for businesses to try and make a profit. A socialist system where the government owns the key resources, so state-owned enterprises, and they're run on behalf of the government. It's probably less of a profit motive. And then a mixture or a mixed economy, which has some private and some state-owned enterprises. These different types of economic systems are not a big part of the study guide, so I'll just run through them relatively quickly. Market capitalism, basically the two key words there, capitalism. Whenever you see capitalism, think private ownership. Okay, so individuals own resources, and market basically means that demand and supply determine what is produced. So markets where we buy and sell goods and services, if there's increased demand, prices go up. If there's increased supply, prices go down, etc., etc. So capitalism means productive resources are owned by individuals. Market means that things are sold based on demand and supply. Planned socialism is the opposite. Basically, the government owns the resources. That's what socialism means. And planned means that the government also determines what's produced, so they make the decisions as to what is produced. So the productive assets are state-owned, and rather than the market or demand and supply determining what is produced, the government chooses what is produced. Then you've got planned capitalism and market socialism, bit of a mix of both. You don't need to know these in details, but basically capitalism, so things are privately owned, but planned, the government still has a big say in what's produced. So often things can be privately owned, but if the government through force may force businesses to produce certain things, so like in a war, they may force them to provide defence equipment, for example, or put more money towards artillery. The opposite to that is market socialism. So socialism, things are government owned, but they still let the market determine what is produced. So demand and supply still determine what is produced. Don't worry about knowing these in a lot of detail. What's more important is we look at what we do in Australia and look at how we answer the three economic questions. So Australia is a mix between market capitalism, so private ownership, demand and supply determining what is produced, and planned socialism, which means that some things are still government owned, schools, hospitals, etc., and the government still has some say in what sort of things are produced. So mostly, if we're looking at how Australia answers the question of what to produce, which we'll expand on in a second, basically producers produce what consumers want. This is the idea of consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty means that in a market economy, it is consumers that dictate what is produced, because producers will follow or respond to price signals, which basically means whatever's expensive, whatever they can make a good profit out of, they will produce. So in a market economy like Australia, it's mainly consumer sovereignty that dictates what is produced. Suppliers will allocate land, labour and capital to products in demand where they can receive a high price. The government does step in, though, to provide some goods and services and distribute welfare to those who need it. So the three basic economic questions we're going to look at is what and how much to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. So essentially, I'm just going to give you an overview of how we answer all three in Australia and then look at each of them individually. So starting with what and how much to produce, that's the first economic question. You do need to know what the three questions are. So what and how much to produce, basically it's mainly dictated by consumer sovereignty. Now that sounds complicated, but basically all that means is produce what consumers want. When there's more demand for a product, so it's demand and supply that determines what is produced and the profit motive. When demand for a product increases, you can generally sell it at a higher price, and that provides a price signal and an incentive for self-interested, profit-motivated producers to shift more resources into that product. Okay, so mainly when you're talking about how resources are allocated in a market economy or in Australia, it's mainly through consumers' decisions or consumer sovereignty. Producers produce what consumers want because that's where they get the highest profit, and we know they're self-interested and want to maximise their own profits. Things are 80% privately owned, and it's private businesses that determine what is produced. And then the government does intervene. It's not purely based on consumer sovereignty. Okay, the problem with that is that sometimes consumers will want things that aren't in the best interest of society, so alcohol, weapons, drugs. The government steps in through taxes and bans to prevent certain products from being produced, but they also subsidise and provide certain products themselves, what we call merit goods, or goods that are good for society, like education and health, that are underprovided in a free market. So it's important when you're answering how Australia answers the three economic questions that it's mainly based on consumer sovereignty. It's mainly based on the profit motive and demand and supply, with some government intervention through taxes, bans, and subsidies to try and ensure the right goods and services are produced. How to produce is the second question. So what kind of things we're going to make? Whether we're mainly going to use labour or people in the production process, or use more capital, labour or capital intensive. So capital intensive just means using more machinery, robotics, etc., etc. Essentially, businesses will make that decision based on whatever is more cost effective and profitable. Two key words you want to learn there: cost effective and profitable. What we mean by that is whatever's cheapest to use and whatever's going to generate the most profit. So if it's cheaper to use labour, self-interested, profit-motivated producers will use labour, and vice versa. So with automation and machines becoming smarter, often businesses will find they can do things cheaper and faster using machinery, and therefore they'll be using your machinery in the production process. The government does influence this how to produce question, and they do that through a range of things. For example, a minimum wage. A minimum wage actually encourages firms to be more capital intensive, because a minimum wage increases firms' cost of production to hire unskilled workers or low paid workers, and therefore they may be more capital intensive. But if they want them to be more labour intensive, they may give subsidies, or that's basically cash, to hire workers. So here's $5,000-$10,000 to hire more labour, then they're more likely to hire more labour in the production process. Subsidies to invest in new technology will encourage us to be more capital intensive as well. So it's basically, a key word is it's based on the relative price of different factors of production. So if it's more expensive, relatively more expensive to use labour, we use more capital, etc., etc. And the last question, which is probably the trickiest of the three, is for whom to produce. And basically what that means is who gets access to the goods and services that are produced in a society. And basically in a market economy, it's mainly based on people's contribution to the production process. So those that have a lot of skills that are in demand, so if you think doctors, lawyers, entertainers, sports people, they all have skills that are in demand. And therefore, the argument is they get access to more goods and services. So those who contribute more to the production process will get access to most goods and services. Those with skills that are in demand, those that have access to both labour resources or skills as well as land resources will get access to most goods and services and get paid a higher wage or a salary. But because there's a high level of inequality in a market economy, the government will step in through public housing, other concessions, welfare, progressive income taxes to try and make it more even as well. So really briefly, what to produce based on consumer sovereignty, demand and supply, the profit motive, but the government intervenes through these three things. How to produce, whether it's labour or capital intensive, they choose whatever's most efficient or profitable, but the government can step in through a minimum wage, subsidies for employing workers, or tax concessions, so you can save tax if you invest in new capital or technology. And for whom to produce means who gets to buy the goods and services. It's largely based on skills or ownership of factors of production. Those with higher skills generate higher wages, and the government steps in through progressive taxes, welfare, public housing, etc., to try and make it more even so everyone can have a dignified standard of living. So these are sort of going through each individually. I will go through this relatively quickly. What and how to produce, what are we going to make? We're going to make bikes, scooters, solar electricity, etc., etc. What will we make with our scarce capital and labour resources? Because resources are limited, we have to make choices and we can't make everything. Therefore, we've got to choose which goods and services we're going to produce and in what quantities. Australia is a mixed economy, mainly privately owned businesses, and it's the forces of demand and supply that determine what is produced. Producers will respond to consumers' demands, which is mean what consumer sovereignty is, and produce the goods and services that will generate the highest profit, acting in their own self-interest. Higher prices act as price signals to produce certain goods and services. Government also steps in to try and intervene with market failures. So what we're saying is basically if we leave demand and supply in the free market to itself, it will fail, and it fails in the sense that some things are overproduced, e.g. drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, and some things are underproduced, like hospitals, schools, emergency services, and what we call these merit and public goods, which we'll talk about later on. But basically the government steps in to intervene to make sure there's a more appropriate allocation of resources. Okay, so Australia's economy is a little bit different to a pure market economy. So the government does have some power to reallocate resources. They redistribute profits to the less fortunate, whereas a purely market capitalist economy would have pure consumer sovereignty, pure privatisation of all privately owned resources and no government intervention. How to produce, what combination of land, labour and capital? Basically, where producers are profit motivated, as we said, they want to be cost effective, so they will choose whatever method, whether it's labour or capital intensive, that is cheaper and more cost effective. Government steps in through minimum wages, taxation incentives, etc., etc. OH&S laws can encourage firms to be more capital intensive because it costs more to hire labour as well, because you've got to pay all these costs associated with health and safety. For whom to produce, again, it's about who gets access to our goods and services. We have a market economy, so it's basically those with higher skills that generally generate higher incomes, assuming those skills are in demand, those who make a more, I suppose, valued contribution to the production process. The government steps in through progressive taxes, so we tax the rich at a higher rate or high income earners at a higher rate. Cash welfare benefits to try and increase access to goods and services for low income earners, so pensions, unemployment benefits, disability pensions, etc. We have a minimum wage so that low skilled workers get access to more goods and services, and cheap public services like healthcare, education, housing. So again, they get access, low income earners get access to these goods and services when they perhaps couldn't in a market economy. But it's important to recognise that's part of that feature of for whom to produce. So a progressive income tax system, this is a bit dated now, but basically the rate of tax you pay, 19 cents, 32.5, 37, 45, it increases the more you earn. So the government can influence how and for whom to produce. We've talked about this basically, so I won't go into that in more detail now. So answers to a few questions to round off the video. What is meant by consumer sovereignty? Consumer sovereignty is the assumption which states that in a freely operating market, so a free market economy, it is the consumers who ultimately decide what is produced and in what quantities. Suppliers will respond to the actions of consumers, and businesses will produce what consumers want because they generate the highest profit. Explain how Australia answers the question of what to produce. In your answer, refer to the goal of government intervention. So there's a few answers here. I'll look at the second one. Australia has a market capitalist economy. 80% of our resources are privately owned and 20% is redirected by the government. What is produced is determined by consumer sovereignty, where what is produced is determined by what consumers demand. As a result, self-interested producers will use their scarce resources, it's important, to produce what consumers demand, but sometimes the government needs to intervene by placing taxes, limiting quantities, or banning certain goods which have negative externalities, and also promoting positive goods and services as well. Explain how scarce resources are allocated in Australia, refer to consumer sovereignty. The invisible hand, basically, that just means that generally in a market economy, producers will produce what consumers want, because that's what's generating the highest profit. So in Australia's mixed economy, land, labour and capital, always to say what they are whenever you get a question about resources, allocated 80% based on market forces. So consumer sovereignty ensures that Australian producers produce what consumers demand. That's because rational producers want to maximise their profits. And then the government step in by taxing, licensing and banning certain products that are overproduced, and also promoting merit goods so they're not underproduced. How do we answer the question of how to produce? Australia answers the question of how to produce by using a combination of labour and capital that is cheapest and most cost efficient, which would maximise profits. They can either be labour intensive, relying mainly on workers, or capital intensive, relying mainly on machinery. And then you can provide an example. So Coles is now using more self-service checkouts because it's cheaper than the traditional method of having checkout people doing those roles. It's cheaper and more profitable. Another example might be automated trucks in the future. And lastly, explain how Australia answers the question of for whom to produce. Explain the role of government intervention. So for whom to produce depends on people's contribution to the labour force or the production process, the value of their land and labour and the amount of resources for production they own. That's really good language. The higher the value of their labour and the more factors of production they own, the higher their incomes will be. As a result, the capitalist system is quite unequal. The government therefore intervenes through progressive taxes, welfare for those who have low incomes, public services for those who need it, to make the distribution of income more even. And that's pretty much it. This goes through all three of the key economic questions. I don't think I'll go through all that in detail, but if you do that, get that question, it's talking about, we'll start with what to produce, then talking about how the market does and then how the government intervenes, which is what this stuff is here. Then talk about how to produce, a combination of land and capital, use a good example, and for whom to produce, talking about the contribution to the production process, and then how the government intervenes through that.